Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
We are with Amin Jaffer, who is in Venice in his house, surrounded by his books, not only books for studying, but also the books he wrote. And the first book he wrote, which was about his passion and his university thesis. He went to school at the university in Canada and then in London. He worked at the V&A for many years. Then he worked for Christie's for many years. And now he is the director at the Thani Collection. And obviously he curates many of the shows that take place at the Musée de la Marine, which is in Place de la Concorde in Paris, and is the Al-Thani Museum somehow. And he also will curate the Islamic Arts Biennale in Jeddah in 2025. So the first book was Furniture from British India and Ceylon. Now you are in Venice. You were born in Rwanda from an Indian family of business people. How come you became so passionate in arts and specifically in India, Ceylon, the times of the maharajas, furniture and all that? Can you tell me a little bit of that?
My career, my life working in art and in institutions is rather improbable given my origins, because as you say, I was born in Central Africa, in Rwanda. I come from a family which had really no art background, very solid business people, let's say. But from a very young age, my mother, I should say my father and mother come from very different backgrounds. My mother's background is a more intellectual one. And from a very young age, whenever we traveled, and my father loved to explore the world, my mother would take me to museums. So when I was 6 years old, we went from Brussels to Paris on the train, and she took me to the Louvre for the first time. It was my first museum. And she gave me a camera, that was my present before entering the Louvre. And I took photographs of course, the most predictable paintings, the coronation of Napoleon, the raft of Medusa, all of the predictable things, the winged victory, which I still have. But that was really the beginning of a lifelong passion, not just in works of art, but in public art projects and the importance of public art.
By public art, you mean museums?
Museums, biennale, exhibitions of different types.
Why you were in Rwanda and how long did you live there before going away and studying abroad and so on?
My mother's family and my father's family were very typical. Kutch is part of Gujarat in Western India, and Kutchis really dominated the sea trade between Western India and the east coast of Africa. And it was the monsoon winds which brought Kutchi merchants, along with merchants from the Gulf and from Malabar, in dhows, these very simple constructions, back and forth, trading in spices and ivory and gold and this sort of thing, and also trading in pilgrims, because they would take pilgrims to Arabia. And when Vasco da Gama arrives on the east coast of Africa, and when he comes to Malindi, it's a Kutchi pilot who helps him to go to India. Any case, so my family on both sides was part of this tradition, settled in Africa decisively in the late 19th century, in the colonial period. And when Central Africa opened up, my great-great-grandfather went into the middle of Africa. Rwanda was German until the end of World War I. It was given to the Belgians as war reparations. And Rwanda and Burundi became part of the Congo. And it therefore opened up. And my grandfather, who was born in Africa, was an athlete, loved sports, and he went to play football in Rwanda in the late 20s. And the country was pristine and open, and he wanted to extend a family business there, which he did. And so for that reason, that's how I was born in this country. And it remained until my teenage years, emotionally and psychologically, my home. Although we traveled a lot in my family, and my father was very much a nomad. It was really only after I became 14, 15, 16 that I physically and emotionally separated from Africa as a home. And that was because I really fell in love with the culture of institutions, of museums in the West, when I realized that I would never work with my family or with my father in a family business, because I would probably be incompetent. But aside from that, it wasn't my center of interest.
So what is interesting is that you are a real cosmopolitan, because you were born in Africa, you stayed there for a long time. you then choose the West. You ended up in school in Canada, but nevertheless, you were always interested in this relationship, North Africa, Europe, but India, Europe, and India and Ceylon, right?
Yes.
And then you obviously wrote books. Why this coming back to India, and why this particular world of Maharajas, of the links between India and
the West. So there are various steps. The first is that my parents were very Occidentalized. They were totally Westernized. And for them, the world was Brussels, Paris, those cities of the West. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather were in suits their whole life. Of course, they love Indian food, they love Indian music, but from their perspective of life, it was a very European one.
And your language was English?
My father was Francophone, but French, English. My mother never learned French. She came from Kenya, so she was Anglophone. And then 2 Indian languages, which were Kutchi, which is our home language, and Gujarati. And then we had Hindi through films and music, English, French, and then local African languages, Swahili or Kinyarwanda. But to answer your question, I think perhaps because my parents were very Western looking, and my grandparents very Western looking, that when I was growing up, I had something of an identity crisis. And I felt myself always very Indian. And I remember my father used to laugh at me because after my first trip to India, I came back with kurta pajamas and Indian clothes. And when I used to wear them, he used to say to me, "You're an imposter. You were never raised like this. I was never raised like this. Your grandfather was never, you're trying to be an Indian, but really you're not." But of course, since a very young age, I felt very, very Indian. And I was determined to know India, determined to find a home. Because I was raised and born in Africa in the late 60s and 70s. It was a period when Africa was African. And the Indian communities that were there were fast disappearing. The Belgians or Brits that were there were fast disappearing. And we found ourselves in a very insecure and unstable environment. So I knew Africa was not my long-term home. I really didn't know where I belonged. I had a very big identity crisis in my teenage years.
Why did you go to Canada?
Oh, it's because my sister was in McGill University. And my parents needed a place to put me. And there was a very good boys' school in Montreal. And my father being Francophone, my mother being Anglophone, they felt that Montreal was a great place for me. And I had very good years in Canada. And then I went to England and, had my academic career in England. But to answer your question about India, I wanted always to know India. But since a very young age, academically, 13, 14, 15, 16 onwards, I became very interested in works of art that were born out of the meeting of 2 cultures or 2 civilizations, hybrid things. I was always interested in hybridity. And when I was a young student at the Victoria and Albert Museum, when I was 21 years old, I went one day into the Indian Gallery. And there I saw a chair in ivory, late 18th century. The form was completely a Robert Adam form. It was an English late 18th century design. And I was fascinated by this curious piece of English furniture made in India in ivory. And I went to see the head of the furniture department, and he said to me, "I can't tell you a thing about it's Indian. It's not really anything to do with the furniture department."
They didn't know much.
They didn't know.
Did you go to India before you went?
No, I had never been to
India.
No, I went to India only later. Then I went to the head of the Indian department, and I showed her the chair, and she said, "Well, this type of chair is European. I mean, it's got nothing to do with India." And all of a sudden, I had this moment of awakening. And the chair sort of represented myself because I was caught between these different cultures without a real identity, but as a product of these different forces. Since nobody knew about this subject, but this sort of furniture proliferates, you see quite a lot of it in English country houses in Portugal.
It was a furniture of which century?
This particular chair was late 18th, but the moment that Europeans arrive in India, from Vasco da Gama all the way to the end, they have a very big problem. They find Indians sitting on textiles on the ground. Europeans arrive, they cannot function without a chair. And what happens from the very beginning is they use cabin furniture from ships. But very quickly, they start to commission Western-style upright furniture for their daily lives. Since India has, throughout the subcontinent, very rich traditions of working luxury materials, what happens very quickly is Indian artisans start to make furniture out of mother of pearl, ebony, ivory, silver, all of these precious materials. And you have a large group of it in museums all around the world, whether it's the Met or the V&A, Buckingham Palace, all over the world, these precious things which were valued from the very beginning, which we call Indo-European furniture. So one part of the story is these hybrid objects made for Westerners who wanted to live in India. The second aspect is how over time, with the rise of Western political power in India, Indian elites start to Westernize and they start to sit on chairs. And this, of course, is very difficult for an Indian to do because it means exposing the soul, which was considered very disrespectful. It means all of a sudden that you do everything at table height. So the interiors and the disposition of rooms in Indian palaces and houses started to change. Indians never had the concept of a bedroom or dining room. The textiles moved according to the season. So this great revolution in body culture in India, which reflected the rise of Western political power and social power in India, became the basis of my doctoral thesis. And it was at a time when we were seeing in Britain, it was at the Royal College of Art, a second generation of Indians who were becoming very present. And the whole question of hybridity and identity and mixture and fusion was the hot subject, which is why I was able to do a book with the support of the British Academy, the Getty, had all of these big forces behind me. And we produced this monumental catalogue that went viral, as it were.
When you were still at the Victoria.
Yeah. So I was a very young curator by the time I produced.
And then you became the curator for...
Yes, I was one of the curators in the Indian department by then.
Later, or I don't know, not much after that, then you were interested in the Maharajas' houses, habits, and you wrote other books.
Exactly.
From jewelry to furniture.
Yes. So this was kind of the second step. As a result of my research on furniture and my doctoral thesis, I had to go to India. And I was hugely excited by the idea of going to India. I landed in Bombay and I felt immediately at home because I heard around me languages that I understood. Being Indian, it was the first time in my life that I disappeared physically, because if I were in Africa or in America or in Europe, I was physically different from everybody. And the minute I arrived in India, I looked around me, everybody looked like me.
And you could dress as an Indian too.
But that's when I started to dress as an Indian. And I could hear Kutchi and Gujarati around me, particularly in Bombay, and eat foods that I, was very familiar, and hear music around me and I felt, okay, I've arrived. I now know what I am and who I am. As a result of my research on the furniture, I was very lucky to travel all around India. I had various research grants from the Leverhulme Foundation, INTAC, and all these grant-giving bodies were supporting my work. I was able to meet one by one the various Indian princes, because they're the ones who had these collections.
But who are these Maharajas? Because not everybody knows what it means.
The Maharajas, the Nawab, the Nizam, they're different classes or different titles of rulers who occupied, let's say, the 500 plus states that made up India in the 19th and in the 20th centuries until independence in 1947. And although they no longer have political power and they were stripped of their titles and privy purse in the 70s by Indira Gandhi, nevertheless, many of them still occupy their palaces and still have some possessions.
And were they respected by the English?
You see, the English really took total political power, control of India after the uprisings of 1857-58. And India became directly a crown colony, and Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. And after that, you had a direct rule. Before that, it was the East India Company, which was a rather ambiguous organization that was trading and ruling. Did the British respect? No, of course, there was a racism, institutional, of course, which meant that Indians had a second-class position because they were the occupied race.
And also the Maharajas?
Yes, so a Maharaja, even though he was a prince, was not allowed into the club, the British club, because he wasn't white, he couldn't be there. Some of them became statesmen, like the Maharaja of Bikaner or Kapurthala. Some became reformists who did wonderful things for their state, like the Maharaja of Baroda. But on the whole, they were politically totally controlled. They could have no army, no foreign policy, etc. And even if they wanted to move out of their state, even if they wanted to go on holiday to Europe, they had to ask permission of the viceroy. And what fascinated me when I went to meet the Maharajas was, again, how they had a hybrid existence. The palaces were often superficially Indianized. And then when you went inside, there'd be the billiard room, the smoking room. It would be a British interior. And when I started to look, because I was a furniture specialist, I recognized that all the furniture was made in London.
So they were Anglophiles.
Totally.
They were obliged to be Anglophiles?
Yes.
Or they liked to be Anglophiles?
I think it's a bit of both. Some became Francophile as well. But the point is that after the establishment of direct rule, Queen Victoria and her government understood that to fully dominate India, what they needed to do is to ensure that the Indian princes, who were the holders of the majority of the land in India, subscribed to British values. So schools were set up all around India for princes, where they would attend with their staff, the whole works. But they would learn English, they would learn to read the Times every morning, they'd learn to play cricket, they'd learn all the forms and habits of a British gentleman. And then they would do the obligatory grand tour to Britain, where they pay homage to the Queen at Windsor Castle. They'd look at factories and schools and hospitals, and then they'd be encouraged to replicate this model. One of the reasons for which we have very good art schools all around India is they were set up in this period. So it was very much the creation of an imperial structure. They were given military orders, they were made knights of the order of, etc. Now, this worked for some princes. Others rejected being part of the system. Others eventually became part of the independence movement. It all depended person to person. But the British concept was very much to create this British culture in India. And as a result, an Indian prince who's been raised in this way, when he comes back from school or back from, could be Cambridge, of course, he can no longer live in the traditional Indian palace because he's no longer fit for that life. What he needs is a palace that has all the trappings of Western lifestyle.
So you were fascinated by this mixture, right?
Yes.
They were still Indians, but with European manners.
Yes.
And at the same time, the furniture, the jewelry reflected that.
Yes, and the automobile collections and the libraries. And the thing that impacted me the most or fascinated me the most was the jewelry. Being Indian, you grow up in a culture of jewelry. Rich or poor, Indian women adorn themselves very richly. They do not have real jewels. They will use flowers or they'll use plastic ones, but there's a big culture of adornment of the body. And I became very interested by the extraordinary commissions made by the Maharajas of jewels from Boucheron, Cartier, Chaumet, Van Cleef, etc. And what they started to do.
They didn't use the Indian jewelry, they used European jewelry.
They wore some Indian jewelry for ceremonial purpose, but the majority of them started to go to the Western luxury houses with gemstones, which would then be completely remodeled and reset in a Western style or in a Western interpretation of an Indian style. So the Great Commission was the Cartier Commission for the Maharaja Patiala. When you look at him, it looks like Indian jewelry because the forms are Indian, but it's all made in platinum. The diamonds are all recut in a Western style and taste. And it's this hybrid.
And this is what you write in your book, From the Great Moguls to the Maharajas, which was a show, by the way, at the Al-Thani Collection, right?
It was a show in the Grand Palais.
It belonged to the Al-Thani Collection.
Yes, that particular one. But this was the book that started it all. The English version was called Made for Maharajas, and it was all about objets de luxe made in the West for princes. That could be necklaces, it could be portraits, it could be cars, it could be crystal furniture, and of course the palaces themselves, which is redesigned by Western architects. And it touches, watches, look at these Cartier watches from
but
Polo.
Even if they didn't have political power, they had a lot of money, I imagine.
Yes, they had a lot of money.
To have all this jewelry, all these cars.
Indeed. Well, they received the revenues from their state. All of this goes on until 1947, where you have independence. But the point is, from my perspective, I became fascinated by how Indian princes guarded their customs and traditions, procession, ceremonial, coronation. But increasingly, the paraphernalia was no longer Indian, it was Western. And why this was important to me is it reminded me a lot of myself and my family, because I grew up in a completely Western style environment. But the fact is, we still had the same traditions, but all of the accoutrements were European. So the subject of the Maharaja became big fascination, and I produced various books and a big exhibition at the V&A. To give you an idea of the show, we opened up with an elephant, a model of an elephant, with all the elephant trappings to show procession. And we ended with the most fantastic Rolls Royce, showing how over the centuries, the Maharajas...
the elephant to the Rolls Royce.
Exactly. So it was all about transformation. It was just around this time that I had the really great luck to meet, at that time, an emerging collector, which was a prince from the Qatar royal family called Sheikh Hamad bin Abdullah Al-Thani, who was collecting already in various domains, French 18th century furniture and paintings and objects of high quality from the early modern period. And we met, and he became passionate about India. He had already an important portrait of the Maharaja of Indore, painted by Boutet de Monvel, so French artist painting an Indian prince. And Sheikh Hamad formed a very important collection of Indian royal jewels. And I worked with him over many years to show these jewels in major exhibitions at the V&A.
But you worked with him after Christie's after the Victoria and Albert, or you were already working together? He was a client of yours at Christie's?
He was indeed a big client of Christie's. But when I joined Christie's and when we were negotiating my contract, I made a clause that I would be allowed to continue doing academic projects, but I didn't want to give up doing exhibitions. And so I had the privilege, while being International Director of Asian Art at Christie's, to be working with Sheikh Hamad on producing books and exhibitions. And we did them at the Met, the V&A, the Grand Palais, the Palazzo Ducale here in Venice. We did a very beautiful show in the Forbidden City in Beijing, in Fine Arts Museum, in the Legion of Honor in San Francisco, etc., etc. And then different exhibitions from the Al-Thani Collection, for example, at Fontainebleau.
Where is the Al-Thani Collection?
Well, physically, it's present in Paris, in the Hôtel de la Marine, in the Place de la Concorde. But to explain it a little bit, Sheikh Hamad bin Abdullah Al-Thani did not start collecting with the idea of making a museum. He started collecting for himself, for works that interested him, that fed his appetite as a connoisseur and somebody fascinated by different world civilizations. And he was collecting works of art that touched him and moved him, whether they were Neolithic or whether they were contemporary, from all different civilizations. So there was high points of human creativity. That's the defining, let's say, aspect or parameter of the collection. Naturally, the objects that he was collecting were of such a significance that they were often requested for exhibitions in museums, or they were put out to loan. When Sheikh Hamad and I started to do things together, we worked with institutions to do exhibitions just from the Al-Thani collection. And when we reached 2017 and 2018, Sheikh Hamad and I both understood that what was needed was a more permanent home where the collection could be displayed.
Why didn't he do the institution in his own country?
Well, I think it's because there are already, by that point, 2017-18, exist really fantastic new museums in Doha, but also because Sheikh Hamad himself is a totally international figure who spends a lot of his time in the West. And the way that the Al-Thani Collection project in Paris happened was rather organically rather than strategically. One day, Sheikh Hamad received a letter from Prince Amin Jaffer, in which he learned about the project to restore the Hôtel de la Marine. Because Sheikh Hamad is a collector of 18th century French things of some renown.
But the Hôtel de la Marine belonged to
the French state.
French state.
Yeah. And Amin Jaffer is one of the ambassadors for the project, raising interest and awareness and funds, obviously, to do the project. And he wrote to Sheikh Hamad to ask him to come and see the site and to see whether there was anything that could be done with the Al-Thani collection. Sheikh Hamad gave me the letter and asked me to go to Paris. And I went there to meet Philippe Bellaval, who was the head of the Centre des Monuments Nationaux, the French governmental agency, which was given the responsibility for looking after the restoration of the monument and to finance it and to open it to the public. I met him through the offices of Joseph Ashkar and Michel Charrière, who were the two French decorators, historic, let's say, conservators, who were going to restore the historic apartments of the Hôtel de la Marine. And Philippe Bellaval and I, he representing the CMN, me representing Sheikh Hamad, over several months had conversations, and it was agreed finally that the Al-Thani collection, for a period of 20 years, would occupy a space in this monument. How was that possible? Because the space in question was the former reserved for the tapestries of the kings of France. The Hôtel de la Marine was built as the Garde de Meubles de la Couronne. It was built for the King of France's art collection, Louis XV and Louis XVI. And it was ultimately
as a storage place.
As a storage and exhibition place, with remarkable apartments for the haute fonctionnaire who looked after the collection, the intendant. But there were also fantastic galleries because the Hôtel de la Marine was open to the public from the 1775, which makes it, along with the Cabinet des Médailles, the first museum experience in Paris, where you could buy a ticket and you could see the silver, the bronzes, the jewels, etc., of the kings of France. After the revolution, the building is given to the Navy, which is why we call it the Hôtel de la Marine. But more recently, the idea was the French Navy was moved to a building that was more suited to the technology of today. And the idea was to open this building to the public as a monument historique in the Place de la Concorde. The historic apartments, let's say, were easily convertible into museum space for the public. But on the Piano Nobile, there were 500 square meters of excellent space with high ceilings and grand volumes, but no decoration because these were storage rooms for tapestries.
And that's where you placed the collection.
Well, that's where we were invited to do something. And why it was possible was because there was no historic decoration there. So we could make a museum of today. As soon as the project was announced and I started to work with Sheikh Hamad, because of course there were negotiations and a contract that needed to be signed, all of Paris, because I had to start to spend time in Paris, expected that what the project would be is one of an 18th century style museum, to remake the Museum of Louis XVI, the display of Louis XVI. And Sheikh Hamad said to me very quickly that it would be a mistake to make a pastiche of the 18th century in a palace that has already superb, authentic interiors of the 18th century. What we must do is a museum, not just of today, but of tomorrow. And so there started a very long search, and ultimately an architect was chosen, Tsuyoshi Tane. He was recommended by Sugimoto, the artist, and he's a, let's say, Franco-Japanese architect who conceived a very brilliant original interior, which evokes a bit from the 18th century, but it's totally contemporary. And he divided up the space into 4 galleries, and we opened the museum in autumn of 2021, just after COVID period. So we worked on the project during COVID. Of course, it was a bit delayed for that reason. And what we do in the space is that we have exhibitions from the Al-Thani collection, but we also show exhibitions created in dialogue with other museums, such as the Gulbenkian Museum.
Yes, we just did this with the Gulbenkian collection.
We did something with the Cadoro in Venice. We've done 2 brilliant exhibitions with the Victorian Art Museum.
Exhibition award.
With the V&A? Well, if I can give you some background, I cut my teeth at the V&A. My first 13 years professionally were in the museum. And I remained very attached to the museum. When I came to Paris, it was just after the Brexit was announced and it was in the air. And everybody I met asked me, why did Brexit happen? Why would the British do this type of thing of creating barriers with continental Europe, the largest trading partner? It doesn't make any sense. And I felt for this reason that we should do 3 exhibitions, a series of exhibitions that focus on Britain and the continent through works of art. The V&A Museum is well known as a name in Paris, but it had never before had an exhibition in Paris. It's lent works of art. It's never had an exhibition. So we began to work with the director of the V&A on 3 shows. The first one was on the medieval period, and we gave it a very provocative title, Quand les Anglais parlaient français. And it's all about the Norman and the Angevin period, when the kings of England were French in terms of bloodlines and culture, and when, for a time, they occupied more land in France than the kings of France, through these very strategic marriages, which, of course, leads to the 100 Years' War and the loss of the 100 Years' War, after which England starts really to look at overseas as an empire because it's lost its continental holdings. So this subject became the center of an exhibition to which the V&A contributed with the most extraordinary loans, precious things like the Becket casket, a reliquary holding the bones of Thomas Becket, many, many objects that show how closely intertwined culturally, economically, artistically was England with continental Europe. Many works of art which you're convinced are French, but are made in London actually, or many things that have these curious joint provenances because of ecclesiastical links or dynastic links.
But this kind of mixture, Anglo-French, Indian, it's very much your thing, right? You like to do this.
Well, I like to show through works of art
influences of one country or the other.
Yeah, I'm not a very political person, but I also like to make people aware that it's dangerous to oversimplify ideas of identity, nationhood, and culture.
That's right.
Because during the Brexit period, of course, the overall rhetoric of Brexiteers was that Britain really is very separate from Europe. It's apart. The British are different people.
They're trying now to understand that it's not the case.
Well, it's not the case at all because, the English language is made up of, Middle and Old German and Middle and Old French, principally. I mean, most of Europe, including much of the British Isles, was Roman occupied for 400 years. There's a basis and a foundation of a close.
So this exhibition was successful?
It was the most successful show, I think, that we've done. And although the medieval period is always viewed as a kind of a dusty time, the very serious museum going public of Paris and, let's say, this great city of culture ensured that the show was a big success. But also the fact is, when we do an exhibition at the Al-Thani Collection, we don't want to just show beautiful things. There has always to be a very strong premise behind it and a real purpose. And it's when you have a purpose and you walk through an exhibition that you understand the meaning of the works of art.
And what are your next projects?
We're opening a beautiful exhibition in the autumn, which is called Color Speaks All Languages. And here we look at works of art. It comes just from the Al-Thani collection. Works of art from across the Al-Thani collection divided according to color. So there'll be a vitrine of blue, vitrine of green, vitrine of yellow, but objects from different civilizations. And the idea here is we want to show the public how different colors mean different things to different people, you know, with objects from antiquity to the present day. That's the next show. And then we're working on a very major blockbuster show for 25. I can't tell you about it yet because we're still negotiating. But the idea is to do things that are complementary and original. I should tell you that the way that works of art are shown in the Al-Thani collection are quite different from the way in which French national museums show things. We don't really show works of art in context. The great national museums do that very well. We show works of art very much in isolation because the idea is to look at an object and to understand an object, to understand the materiality, the aesthetics. We're not afraid to say the word beauty. It's a very important aspect of the collection. And our goal, which I believe we have accomplished based on, you know, writings in the press, is to create an aesthetic offering, a museum offering that's complementary to the big museums of Paris. In the latest press reviews of our we had a big Renaissance show recently. We were very, very delighted to read more than one journalist saying that across these 2 years, the Al-Thani collection has established itself as a new museum presence in Paris. And yes, for people who are interested in culture, interested in works of art of quality.
Because you have constant exhibitions.
Yes, we have twice a year an exhibition. Yeah. So the space is constantly.
And is the collection growing? I mean, is Al-Thani buying new things?
Absolutely, yes. The collection is still very much reflective of the taste and the journey of Sheikh Hamad.
And you are working on that too?
No, not really. The collecting is very much Sheikh Hamad's domain. He is somebody that visits actively exhibitions and reads the catalogue. He travels around the world following his interests. Like any collector, his interests evolve in different areas and different directions. That evolution in interest will result in new acquisitions. So the collection does grow, and we have many, many, many years in which to show the richness and the diversity. For example, when we showed the Renaissance exhibition, which opened a few months ago, it was a dialogue between Al-Thani and V&A in Renaissance art. Why? Well, because if you're raised in Paris and you know the Louvre collection of Renaissance art reflects the taste of François Ier, Henri IV, Louis XIV, it's a French royal collection. The V&A collection is formed from 1852 onwards by museum directors and curators who say, we should have some hardstone carving. Okay. We should have some enamels. We must really represent Donatello. We must really have a manuscript. You see, it's an academic collection. Mm-hmm. It's very different from the Louvre.
Collection is,
It's not based in a royal collection of the Renaissance. It's a new collection. So the Al-Thani collection is the same. It's acquired recently with Sheikh Hamad thinking, what do I love most about the Renaissance? Well, I like this, I like that. I think this is important. And so we showed the dialogue between the two collections, looking at priorities in collecting in the Renaissance. So this show is very much focused on collections, which is the backbone of the Al-Thani collection, where we really look at why do people acquire certain things. Why I'm saying this is that when the French public came to see the Renaissance show, the response we had is, we had no idea the Al-Thani collection was so rich in the Renaissance. But Renaissance show before us, we didn't have the chance until now. So the collection is full of mystery.
But in the same time, you also are the director of the Islamic Arts Biennale in Jeddah. Why? That's another world, another country.
Yes, it's a really interesting project for me. I've always worked in, always with, let's say, quite elite objects with, exhibitions that are quite focused. And luxury has been one of the determining aspects of the projects I've worked on because I've always been gravitated towards jewelry and precious things. At the end of 2023, I was approached by the Diriyah Biennale Foundation in Saudi Arabia, which asked me whether I would be interested in being an artistic director for the Islamic Art Biennale. I had never, it's in its second edition, I had not been to the first one, but Julian Raby, a very towering figure in the world of Islamic art who had been head of the Freer Sackler, was involved in the first edition. Sheikh Hamad went to the first edition, and I had heard very glowing reports of this first edition. Why was it so interesting? Because the conception of the Biennale is to show historic works of Islamic art from across civilizations in dialogue with contemporary creations. So, my type of thing, it's about dialogue. And the display and scenography was done by the office of Rem Koolhaas, was really super visionary and original. And I saw the photographs and I was very impressed. So when I was asked to do the project, I, of course, was very honored, but I didn't understand how I would manage it because I have already a full-time job working with the Al-Thani collection.
We are in Venice, where you live. how can you live in Venice and do all these things around the world? I mean, in Paris, in Saudi Arabia, and other places. And also, imagine to contact museums and having loans and private collector. I mean, it's a big job.
It's a big job.
How do you handle it from this house, from the Canal Grande in Venice? You know?
I handle it from this Empire desk. No, it's a huge job, but I'm not for the Al-Thani Collection and with the Biennale. I'm part of a very numerous and very highly qualified team. So in terms of loans, for everything, as you know, now happens very much virtually through Zooms and Skypes and this type of thing. Of course, I'm flying around the world for one-to-one meetings when they're essential, but I form part of a team of a number of people, you know, that are working with me to realize the projects. But of course, if you see my agenda or if you know me well personally, you know that from 9 in the morning until 6 in the evening, I'm in non-stop meetings on all different aspects, you know, whether it's communication, publicity, catalog layout, loan agreements, insurances, you know, there's lots of negotiating to do all the time and things to organize. But one can work just as well here. I came to Venice when I was 9 the first time. And I remember saying to myself that it was the most magnificent place in the world. My father was quite technical, and I asked him quite a lot of questions about how the buildings floated, how they worked, and he had a very good engineering mind. And I came back after that when I was 18, and I was lucky to know a lady at that time called Valentina Cortese, who was an Italian actress. Yes, I wrote to her out of the blue because I saw her apartment in House and Garden magazine. I was an 18-year-old fan of interior decoration, and she received me, and she was the one who opened Venice for me. And after that, although I, you know, was a student with very reduced means, I would always come and rent little apartments, or if I had to write a project, I would stay in a pensione for months and write. And I found always the city inspiring because I grew up since my earliest days with a huge dislike of cars. I never liked cars. I never owned a car in my life.
You're not like a manager.
No, I prefer the elephant. Because I was here from very, very early time, I made early friendships from my 20s, which I still have here. And over the years, I always dreamed to be in Venice, but it was never possible. You know, I had full-time jobs. And when COVID happened, I found myself in a very lost position because I had no country. I couldn't go back to Britain because I had formally left from a residency perspective. Africa, what, of course. Where was I going to go? I could have stayed locked up in Paris with the very strict rules of 6 p.m., but, you know, I had no family. I had no life in fact, but a few friends, but, you know, I had nowhere to go. So I thought of Venice. And I rented the top floor of a palazzo on the Grand Canal, a Gothic palace that I'd rented before and stayed in before. The city was a very safe one in COVID. It was closed except the terraces. And so I realized after a few weeks how much I enjoyed the life here, and particularly the simple aspects of life, the village, going to the market, the French.
So you made your headquarters here now?
Well, I realized it made a lot of sense. And I love the aspect of the market. I love the aspect of the boat and nature, of walking all the time, of feeling well. And Venice is the place after the COVID, obviously, which is very well centered in my mind because Venice was always the gateway of the Orient. For most of Europe, Venice was the beginning of the Orient because after this was the Ottoman Empire. So it suits me very well because I'm an Oriental in Venice.
You have a new book? Are you writing a new book?
Well, the next book that I'm working on is the catalogue of the Biennale, of course, which opens in January, where I'm co-writing a big introductory essay and working with the team on the catalogue entries, of course, and the structure. And then we're going to start working shortly on the 2025 Al-Thani exhibition catalogue. We just have to define that.
So you have a lot to know about France at the moment, right?
Well, you know,
there's many things going on.
There's a lot to know. It's very liberating to be a foreigner in a country because you don't carry the burden. You don't carry.
You have been a foreigner all your life, more or less.
Britain has been the dominant force in my culture because I was born with a British passport.
I see.
And my mother's family is a very Anglophone family. So I grew up understanding British process, thought, school, education, language, culture. And so I feel very aligned to what happens in Britain. But more and more, I feel separated from the British Isles. And I knew the day had come for me when I was in my London. I have an apartment in London. I was waking up one Sunday in London and I wanted to go and buy some croissant and pain au chocolat and all this stuff. And there was no bakeries because the English don't need fresh bread on a Sunday morning. And there were a couple, but they were in the French parts of London, like Marylebone or South Kensington. And that morning, I realized that I no longer belonged in London because, you know, the way I lived didn't accord with the city at all anymore. The other thing living in Venice and Paris is that you become very used to walking absolutely everywhere, but the cities are manageable in scale. And in London, it's totally impossible. It's just the scale of the city is a different dimension. The other thing that has affected me a lot is that London is a city that evolves. And almost every time I go, there's another building I love that's disappeared. If you drive along the South Bank of London now, you see on the left-hand side completely new developments of mammoth dimensions. And because I'm somebody who looks back a lot in life, I find that jarring.
I hope you don't look too much back, but forward for your projects and your life. I wish you good luck for your Biennale.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for being with us this morning.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alain Elkann interviews.